Hello, welcome to Walk, Don't Run to the Doctor with Miles Hassell, MD. This is an evidence-based podcast for people who want to use lifestyle choices to avoid preventable illness, as well as to treat illness. Listeners will learn the choices that work for better health outcomes for themselves, the ones that they love, and the patients they care for. We want to see patients liberated from the burden of chronic disease whenever possible. Hello, thanks for coming back. Today we're going to be talking about the best fats for best health part 2, and that's going to be dealing with sort of dairy and saturated fat, and in the future we'll deal with red meat and eggs. But the basic question today is, are dairy and saturated fats friend or foe for us? Last time we talked about how extra virgin olive oil is associated with much better health outcomes across a broad spectrum of disease. And that leads to this thing that we need to define, which is, what are good fats? And so we'll talk a little bit more about how we collect information and how we assess data. But good fats in general in our world are fats that are associated with better health outcomes in the context of good diets. So this dispenses with any sort of biochemical theory, but just looks at purely at outcomes data. Outcomes of real people in the real world eating real food. And so when we see that, we see pretty much all traditional foods and end up looking like good foods, including the foods that contain fat. Extra virgin olive oil is, most people don't have a problem with it as being good fat. Dairy fats and saturated fats are a separate issue, and there's a lot of controversy over whether they are harmful or not. And it revolves around cholesterol, it revolves around saturated fat, revolves a lot around theories. And so today we're going to be talking not about theory, but actual outcomes evidence, what happens in the real world. And obviously we're always talking in the context of whole food omnivorous diets. In other words, diets that have a broad range of foods in them, fruits, vegetables, beans, grains, animal proteins, dairy, primarily, we're always going to be assuming that people realize we're talking about foods made at home. And we often talk about the Mediterranean diet, which is sort of a label for a version of omnivorous diets that is primarily reflecting patterns seen in the southern Mediterranean and near Middle East areas. And we're just going to be, as part of our background to how we look at dairy and saturated fat and why conclusions we come to might be quite different from those of other organizations, is how we approach accumulating evidence. And so the first line of evidence we use is, what have people eaten when they've had a choice over recorded history? And we know that dairy foods and saturated fats have been, through the entire recorded history of humankind, have been part of the diet. Next, we look at what are high-quality medical studies and what do we learn from them. And you can consider the methodologies such as observational studies, retrospective studies, prospective studies, randomized prospective studies, randomized controlled trials, meta-analysis, and so on. And you'll see that we largely rely on meta-analysis and systematic reviews to try to get away from any cherry picking of data. And we've also kind of influenced by what we see in the real world, what seems to be work for patients in our practice, but that's not a prominent part of our rationale. And throughout this, we try to be evidence-based rather than eminence-based, rather than opinion-based. And when we're assessing studies, we look at whether they're peer-reviewed, how many participants were in the studies, what methodology was used, how long they went for, and whether results are statistically and clinically significant. And finally, what do other comparable studies show? For example, if we see 10 studies showing benefit for something and 10 studies showing harm, then we wouldn't want to only point out the studies showing benefit. We'd say, you know what, the data are mixed. We don't know what conclusions should be drawn, for example. But we always like to remember one critical thing, and that is, if people have habitually eaten a diet containing a particular food, let's say dairy, and those people are still around, then we have a hard time being highly critical of that food unless we can clearly show that people who ate that food, such as dairy, are less healthy. And we would argue that dairy foods are not associated with less health, but better health. Which means that you also have to define what does healthy mean. And the most dominant marker of health that we use in these big studies is total mortality. Over the course of the study, were there more deaths or less deaths in this food being studied? So for example, if you're looking at dairy foods, then you have to ask yourself, did more people or less people die if they ate more dairy or less dairy? And that's really, really important. And we avoid what's called surrogate markers. So that can be anything that isn't associated with a true disease, such as cancer or diabetes or heart disease or stroke or death. And we also avoid any studies that involve mathematical modeling. So if you see a significant difference between what I'm concluding in this presentation and what you might see in other studies or other presentations, look and see how was the data analyzed, and did it include a lot of surrogate markers? Did it include a lot of mathematical modeling, which is not something that we think should be part of this assessment. And in the background, whenever you're listening to anybody talking about lifestyle and disease outcomes, remember that lifestyle medicine information is poor quality information. The fact that we're dealing with humans, which are very poor quality subjects to study, and nutrition is incredibly variable. And we could talk at length just about why nutrition data is so variable, but it means that you need to be really, really super careful about making definite conclusions from anybody's theory or any one study. Why does it matter? Well, it matters because a lot of us like dairy foods. So if you like dairy foods, then you better know whether they're good for you or bad for you, whether this is something that can be eaten on a daily basis or whether it should be a special occasion food. For example, I don't think Cheerios are a particularly healthy food, but I love Cheerios, so I get a box of Cheerios on my birthday, and that's about it. So when people eat full-fat dairy and other traditional high-fat foods, they often feel more satisfied. They're less attracted to sweets and refined grain foods, which we know are probably harmful in our patient population. And they can stick to their pattern of better eating with less difficulty, less self-control being needed than if we eliminate foods such as full-fat dairy. So in practical terms, it's kind of important. It's also important just to know if these things are good for you or bad for you. If we look at observational studies, and so these are the big observational studies you'll hear me cite quite often, such as the EPIC studies, the PURE studies, InterHeart, InterStroke, Nurses Health Studies, Health Professionals Follow-Up Study, and the various Mediterranean diet studies, then we tend to see that the best health outcomes are in those people that eat a healthy omnivorous diet. Lots of plant foods, so that's fruits, vegetables, beans, and grains, cultured dairy, fish, meats, and traditional oils, especially olive oil. Whereas we have a hard time seeing great benefit in these large studies when people are on a very low fat or vegetarian diet. And frankly, most of us don't want to eat those diets either. So in the absence of evidence that they're actually healthier, we would say stick to a tastier, healthy, omnivorous diet that includes good fats such as dairy. It's not as easy to show that milk is good for you as it is fermented milk products. So milk might be fine, but it hasn't really been a traditional food in any kind of large quantity until refrigeration came about, simply because in most climates it ferments quite rapidly. So fermented versions were the primary storage form of dairy. And so with that regard, we're not at all sure that milk is a great product to be used in large quantities. So we tend to use it in minimal quantities. I put it in my tea, for example. But other than that, I try to minimize milk intake and as a form of dairy. Whether I'm right in that or not is not clear. But if we look at the data for fermented foods, fermented dairy foods in particular, then we can see, and the studies I'm citing are in the show notes, but We can see a reduced risk of fractures, especially hip fractures, which is by far the most important in postmenopausal women. That's a systematic review of randomized controlled trials. We see lower inflammatory markers, better blood pressure, less abdominal fat, favorable cholesterol changes, that's primarily driven by the HDL changes, better blood sugar, and better insulin levels. And that's kind of important from the perspective of whenever you see a broad range of potential benefits, then that takes away a lot of the potential for an element of significant harm showing up. We see less depression in people who eat dairy foods. We see less breast and colon cancer, lower rates of type 2 diabetes, better cardiovascular outcomes, and better gut health, so more stable GI tracts. And that's a systematic review that I'm citing with 108 studies. Japanese data shows a lower total mortality, which is a mixed thing in many of the studies. And the one question mark is over prostate cancer, because some of the studies show that in the highest milk intake groups, there was more prostate cancer, but the data are very mixed. And it would appear that if there is an effect, it must be small. And so what we would argue is that it would certainly be sensible not to have more than 2 or 3 servings of dairy foods a day to avoid the prostate cancer question in men. But probably everybody should not have more than 2 or 3 servings of dairy a day, because if you're having more than that of dairy, then we would argue you're not eating enough of everything else. In other words, you're moving away from a true omnivorous diet. We would argue that dairy foods are shown to be healthy, but it's quite rational for any given food to avoid eating it to excess. Numerous studies have looked at the heart disease issue, which probably for many of the listeners might be their biggest concern with respect to yogurt, kefir, and cheese, that it's going to cause a heart attack. We'd argue that has not been shown to be the case. In fact, that there is a small reduction in cardiovascular disease and a small reduction in total mortality in the studies that looked at that. So the other concern that we have when people are listening to something like this is they think, oh, good, I can go get a latte down at the coffee bar with caramel syrup in it. And we're saying, watch out for the candy bar in a cup, or that yogurt that has 6 or 9 or 12 teaspoons of sugar in it, and so on. Most of the data we've cited have been from systematic reviews and meta-analysis, large observational trials. But there was a relatively recent randomized controlled trial that separated a group of people that had the metabolic syndrome. So these are people that tend to have something like overweight, high blood sugars, high blood pressure, and adverse cholesterol panels. And they were randomized for 12 weeks to limited dairy, low-fat dairy, or full-fat dairy. And the bottom line was, when you had the people eating full-fat dairy versus limited dairy or low-fat dairy, basically nothing different happened over the 12 weeks. Now, that's a short-term study, and it has to be kept in context of that. But it really raises the question for those that believe that dairy foods are bad for you. Do they have a good basis for saying dairy foods are bad for you? Because we look at the randomized control trials, short-term, we look at the observational trials and the larger systematic reviews and meta-analysis, and we're just not seeing it. Some people say, well, it's okay to have dairy food, but only have low-fat dairy food. Well, we can't see a basis for that either. And the reason why this is important is, for many of us, the high-fat dairy foods, in other words, the foods that have the same amount of fat as God made the cows produce, simply taste better. They're more satisfying. They have better mouthfeel. And so, once again, unless there's evidence for harm from those foods, why would we condemn them? Why would we make any rules for our patients that we don't need to make? It takes a fair bit of discipline to eat well in our environment. So why put any obstacles in the path that we don't have to? Another argument that's brought up is dairy causes inflammation. And I already cited some of the data for dairy inflammation, but we have a number of studies. For example, in the show notes, you'll see one study that's 52 that's analysis of 52 different studies looking at dairy inflammation, and finds that dairy is consistently associated with lower inflammatory markers, except in people who have an identified cow milk allergy. So that's not too surprising. So for the rest of us who don't have a cow milk allergy, then dairy foods appear to be anti-inflammatory foods, not pro-inflammatory foods. And in this regard, we'd like to remind people we're talking about real dairy, yogurt, kefir, cheese. We're not talking about candy bar in a cup or candy bar in a yogurt cup. We're not talking about heavily sweetened dairy products, but the real thing that you've prepared at home. People sometimes say, well, the dairy has pro-inflammatory fat, and therefore it's got to be something bad, even though we don't see evidence from the inflammatory studies. And I would argue that that line of reasoning has never been a successful one in nutrition. Nutritional theories rarely work out. And these are often what we call highly reductionist theories. Instead, what works out is what happens with real people eating real food in real time. Are they healthier or are they less healthy? Biological systems are really messy. Foods are really messy. Humans are really messy. And so when we look at dairy, for example, there are pro-inflammatory fats and anti-inflammatory fats in there. So making sense out of all that is almost impossible unless you just rely on real data collected from real humans in real time to tell us what's happening in the real world. Something else that happens is people say, well, I'm switching from dairy because there's all this uncertainty, which we don't actually acknowledge exists, but there's all this uncertainty, and I'm going to eat the milk substitutes instead, oat milk, almond milk from big factories. And we would argue that unless you're making your milk substitute at home, there's really no basis for suspecting that these foods are even good foods. And so, first of all, when you're thinking about eating a commercially prepared milk substitute, look at the ingredients lists. Secondly, ask yourself, are these processed foods that are good for you? What's the basis for suggesting that they're good for you? And I'm arguing you're going to have a hard time finding one. And just think about the highly processed nature of these. These things are made in big factories. And as Michael Pollan said, if it's a plant, eat it. If it comes from a plant, don't. And I think that advice was pretty good 20 years ago, and I think it's pretty good now. Be cautious about having any confidence in factory foods or factory milk substitutes. And in our show notes, we're going to have some studies there that look at non-dairy plant-based beverages and the processing procedures involved in making them. Remembering that these highly processed factory foods are generally associated with poor health outcomes. And that's probably not the way to bet if it's your health. By poor health outcomes, we're talking about more mortality, more cancers, more heart disease, more heart failure, more depression, anxiety, that kind of thing from highly processed foods in general. Whether that applies to highly processed milk substitutes, we really don't know. Those we're not aware that data exists at the present time, but it certainly should. The overall processed food data, factory food data, should concern you. So in our practice, we think that the overall data benefit is primarily demonstrated with yogurt, kefir, and cheese, and arguably even more so with the highly aged cheeses, so sharp cheddars, parmesans, the hard cheeses. How far to take that argument, we really don't know, but some of the compounds in those cheeses, such as vitamin K, are higher. And by no means am I saying, therefore, soft cheeses like, I would be somebody who enjoys a Jack or Longhorn cheese, for example, which are soft and less aged. Are those bad for you? I don't think so. Is Parmesan better for you? Maybe, but I wouldn't lose any sleep over it. Cottage cheese and sour cream are a couple of other traditional cultured foods, buttermilk. But in the current context, a lot of those are made using other processes other than culturing, but that's all available if you look at the label. And we would tend to suggest you stick to the cultured forms of those foods. The gut health is an important reason for thinking about these too. So in order to maintain our patients' healthy gut microbiome, then we often recommend at least small amounts of yogurt and kefir per day in people who don't like them. We suggest making a little smoothie kind of thing with, say, banana, the berries, maybe a touch of honey, along with yogurt and kefir, and make it something that's really tasty. And it'll be a lot tastier if you use the full fat version. Um, a lot of people simply don't tolerate dairy foods for a variety of reasons. Lactose intolerance, dairy protein intolerance, for example. And a couple of things can happen. Some of those people can do well if they only have small amounts every day. Others just need to choose a diet that doesn't include them. And either way, you can do really, really well. Avoiding dairy does not mean you're going to be in poorer health in all probability if you're eating an otherwise healthy diet. While we're on the subject of dairy, let's talk about saturated fat in general. So saturated fat comes from a lot of foods that don't include dairy foods, especially red meat. And so although we're going to have a separate section just on red meat and eggs, I thought we would talk about saturated fat in particular for a second. And so once again, we would argue that the real world data does not show that saturated fat supplied by traditional whole foods is harmful. We do think that the data show that the calories from sugars, refined grains, hydrogenated oils, and highly processed vegetable oils, and maybe processed meat should be a concern to us. That data is a greater concern than the data from saturated fat, which overall we would argue that whole food saturated fats are actually associated with better health outcomes. And this leads to this whole question of being, what does it mean to be open-minded, for example? So saturated fat is so strongly associated in our society with harm that often people can't actually think clearly about it. And there's this Kruger-Dunning effect. Which is there's a paper that we're including in our show notes. The original paper was called "Unskilled, Unaware of It: How Difficulties in Recognizing One's Own Incompetence Leads to Inflated Self-Assessments." And so often we find that people who are condemning saturated fat actually don't know the data. And so if you're going to have an opinion about saturated fat, sort of know what the papers are and have a strong basis for your opinion. Now there's some extremely accomplished people in the lifestyle medicine world who do think that saturated fat's bad for you, and I'm going to include a paper from those people. But overall, we would argue that with respect to health outcomes, most studies from the observational perspective show no association between saturated fat and heart disease, for example. The randomized control trials, which tend to be fairly short, are very, very inconsistent and suggest no association. The one thing that keeps showing up, we would submit in saturated fat data, is a lower risk of stroke when you have a higher amount of saturated fat. Saying that again, so greater levels of intake of saturated fat in the context of the overall diet of food appears to be associated with lower rates of stroke. So although the heart disease data is very mixed and probably inconclusive, but not showing harm, the saturated fat and stroke data suggests more saturated fat is actually associated with less stroke. And so just thinking for a second about the difficulty in studying this, if you're somebody who's eating a typical Mediterranean diet with more vegetable fat than animal fat, because your diet is heavily influenced by extra virgin olive oil and nuts, for example, avocados, that's going to be completely different than somebody who isn't following a whole food Mediterranean style diet. And so this should raise questions in anybody's mind: is how was this data accumulated, and is it accurate? Because it's really hard to get this kind of data, and that's why we keep asking people to look at the preponderance of data from multiple studies and look at especially systematic reviews and randomized controlled trials. And there's a fabulous pro-con, two different opposing sides being represented in a pair of papers in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition in 2020 that we highly commend you read if you're interested in this topic, and you get a sense of how different experts approach the subject and why they come to different conclusions. Other people say, well, we should avoid those fats because they're making me gain weight. And in actual fact, the fat intake in the diet is not particularly associated with gaining weight or not gaining weight. In fact, if you're going to look at any group of foods that's associated with more weight gain, it's probably carbohydrates because they don't turn off your diet well enough. And that's why many of the paleo diets, the keto diets, Atkins style diets that have more fat actually tend, in most people, not everybody, tend to be associated with better weight loss. Now, we're not saying those are preferable diets for health outcomes, but we think that they're really worth pointing out because they are associated with weight loss in most people. We would still argue that the Mediterranean style diets are excellent choices for weight loss, but they're also better choices for overall health outcomes. But if you're struggling with weight, don't forget that you're eating too much. And eating too much food, even good food, is still too much. And if you're not losing weight, you've got to cut your calories. And the first calories we suggest you avoid are the sweets, refined grains, and processed foods made outside of your home. And although exercise by itself is a very weak weight loss tool, it's a great weight maintenance tool and a great weight redistribution tool. In other words, it puts weight on better places in your body. So even though you may find that your exercise level does not help you lose weight, it will make you a healthier person. So include that as part of your weight loss program. So that's it for today. We're going to be talking about red meat and eggs at some future time. And we'd like to remind you, as long as we're talking about fats, to remember that the two families of fats that we think you should vigorously avoid are hydrogenated oils. Those are the ones that have the trans fats in them. And highly processed vegetable oils, even if they say cold pressed. So that's your canola, soy, corn, peanut, avocado, and grapeseed oils, because of their extensive processing with chemicals and high heat. That processing is necessary in these oils in order to give them a neutral taste and a long shelf life. But it does leave them severely nutrient depleted. And to the extent that we have data, such as the Sydney Heart study, they do appear to be associated with worse health outcomes. So we're arguing, don't demonize saturated fat in whole food, but include it as part of an appropriate diet, appropriate omnivorous whole food diet with your foods primarily cooked at home. So once again, this is representing greatmed.org. We're busy building a library of lifestyle-focused medical education tools that are evidence-based, easily accessible online, free, current, and we're unaware of any resource like it right now. I'm Miles Hassell, MD. The website is greatmed.org. The book is Good Food, Great Medicine that I've written with my sister, and we're currently in the 4th edition. And you're listening to Walk, Don't Run to the Doctor. Thank you.